The wind howled like a banshee across Mount Assiniboine as 16-year-old Jake Morrison watched his hiking group's emergency flare disappear into the white void below. One moment he was securing their camp's guy lines, the next he was completely alone. His teammates swept away by an avalanche that came without warning. The temperature plummeted to -12°C as the worst blizzard in decades engulfed the Canadian Rockies. Most kids would panic, but Jake wasn't most kids. His grandfather, a legendary mountain guide, had died the year before, but not before passing down generations of Indigenous survival wisdom that modern climbers had forgotten. As hypothermia crept through his bones and visibility dropped to zero, Jake remembered his grandfather's words, "The mountain doesn't care about your fear. It only respects your knowledge." With nothing but basic camping gear and his bare hands, Jake began constructing something that would either save his life or become his tomb. The rescue teams had given up hope, declaring the area a death zone. But what was Jake building up there in that frozen hell that would defy every odd? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's hands trembled as he dug through the scattered remains of their camp. The avalanche had swept away everything: the main tent, the cooking gear, most of their food supplies. All that remained was his personal pack, half buried under 2 feet of fresh powder, and Sarah's abandoned sleeping bag caught on a nearby pine branch, like a prayer flag in the screaming wind. His breath came in sharp bursts that crystallized instantly in the Arctic air. Each exhale cost him precious body heat, but panic would cost him more. Grandfather's weathered face materialized in his memory, those deep-set eyes that had seen 60 years of mountain storms. "First rule, Jakey," the old man's voice echoed through the howling gale. "Shelter, warmth, then water. Everything else is luxury." Jake forced his numb fingers to work methodically. The sleeping bag was a gift from the mountain. Rated to -20, it might keep him alive if he could build proper shelter around it. His own tent had been ultralight, designed for summer camping, not survival in a death zone. The wind cut through his jacket like it was made of tissue paper. He needed to find natural protection, something that could form the foundation of a real shelter. Through the swirling snow, he spotted a cluster of evergreens about 30 meters upslope, sturdy spruces that had weathered decades of storms, exactly like this one. Fighting through knee-deep drifts, Jake hauled his salvaged gear toward the trees. Each step was a battle against the wind that seemed determined to launch him off the mountain face. By the time he reached the grove, his core temperature had dropped enough that his thoughts were becoming sluggish. This was how hypothermia killed you, not dramatically, but quietly, stealing your decision-making abilities degree by degree, until you simply laid down and never got back up. "No," he said aloud, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Not today." The largest spruce formed a natural windbreak on the southwest side, its massive trunk thick enough to stop the worst of the gale. Jake began digging, using his camp shovel to excavate a pit in the lee of the tree. The work warmed him, blood flow returning to his extremities as he carved out a depression in the hard-packed snow. Grandfather had taught him this technique during their last trip together, just months before the cancer finally won. The old man had called it a quinji, though he'd learned it from his own grandmother, who'd learned it from ancestors who'd survived mountain winters for generations before Europeans ever saw these peaks. "The snow is your friend, not your enemy," Grandfather had said, demonstrating the ancient technique. "It wants to insulate you, protect you. You just have to know how to ask." Jake dug deeper, his muscles screaming from the effort, but his core warming with each shovelful. The pit needed to be big enough for his body, but small enough to retain heat. Too large and he'd freeze. Too small and he wouldn't fit with his gear. As he worked, the storm intensified. Snow fell so heavily that he had to constantly clear it from his excavation. The wind shifted direction twice, forcing him to adjust his shelter's orientation. What had started as a simple pit was evolving into something more complex, a multi-chambered design that would trap warm air while deflecting the wind. His grandfather's lessons came flooding back with each decision: how to read the wind patterns by watching the snow swirl, which direction offered the best protection on this particular slope, how to tell if the snow was the right consistency for building. But as Jake continued digging into the frozen mountainside, he realized the Quingy was just the beginning. The storm was too powerful, too sustained for a simple snow shelter. He needed something more ambitious, something that would transform this death trap into a genuine sanctuary. The mountain had taken everything from him: his friends, his safety, his margin for error. Now it was offering him one chance at survival if he possessed the knowledge and courage to seize it. The wind hit like a freight train at 3 in the afternoon, turning the world white in seconds. Jake had been following the marked trail back to base camp when the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in what felt like minutes. Now, squinting through the horizontal snow, he couldn't see his own boots. The orange safety flags that marked the route had vanished into the whiteout. His phone showed no signal, not that it mattered with the battery already down to 15% in the cold. The GPS unit his father had insisted he carry was back at camp, sitting uselessly on his cot because he'd thought this would be a quick afternoon hike. "Stupid," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the howling wind. "So damn stupid." The blizzard had come from nowhere, or at least nowhere the weather service had predicted. This morning's forecast called for light snow, maybe an inch. This was something else entirely, a monster storm that turned the familiar trail into an alien landscape. Jake pulled his hood tighter and tried to retrace his steps, but the wind had already erased his tracks. Every direction looked the same, a wall of white that seemed to press against him with physical weight. He fumbled for his compass, fingers already clumsy in his gloves, and watched the needle swing wildly before settling on magnetic north. Base camp was southeast, maybe 2 miles, but 2 miles might as well be 200 in these conditions. His grandfather's voice drifted back to him from summers long past. "Weather don't care about your plans, Jake. Mother Nature's got her own schedule and she don't take appointments." The old man had been full of sayings like that, most of them delivered while teaching Jake things his city friends would never learn. How to read animal tracks in mud, which plants you could eat and which would kill you, how to find water when you were lost. Jake hadn't thought about those lessons in years, had barely tolerated them even then, more interested in his phone than his grandfather's stories. Now, with the wind driving ice crystals into his face like needles, those memories felt precious. "First rule of being lost," Grandpa Tom had said, demonstrating with a stick in the dirt behind his cabin. "Stop moving, sit down, think. Most folks die because they panic and make bad decisions." Jake forced himself to stop walking, though every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to find shelter. He crouched behind a boulder, using it to block some of the wind, and took inventory. Water bottle, half full. Energy bars in his day pack. A small first aid kit. His knife, the one his grandfather had given him for his 13th birthday, matches in a waterproof container. Not much, but not nothing. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it through his jacket, a creeping cold that seemed to seep into his bones. His toes were already going numb despite his winter boots. Without shelter, he wouldn't last the night, and from the look of the storm, this was going to be a long one. If you can't get to shelter, you make shelter. Another of his grandfather's lessons. Nature provides, but you got to know how to ask. Jake looked around with new eyes, searching for anything he could use. The boulder he crouched behind was part of a larger rock formation, creating a natural alcove that provided some protection from the wind. Not enough, but a start. He needed to think bigger, to build something that could keep him alive. The snow was falling so hard now that it was already accumulating around him. Wet, heavy snow, the kind that would pack well. His grandfather had shown him once how to build a proper snow shelter, not the pathetic snow forts he'd made as a kid, but something that could actually save your life. "Snow's the best insulation there is," the old man had explained. "Builds walls that'll keep you warm even when it's 40 below outside. But you got to do it right, or you'll just build yourself a tomb." Jake's hands were shaking as he began to gather snow, and not just from the cold. The weight of his situation was settling in. His parents thought he was on a guided weekend trip with proper supervision. They had no idea he was alone out here, that the other kids in his group had gone home early, that their guide had gotten food poisoning and cancelled. He'd been too embarrassed to admit he wanted to leave too proud to call his parents and ask to come home. That pride seemed ridiculous now as he packed snow into blocks with hands that were rapidly losing feeling. The wind showed no signs of letting up, and the light was already fading from the sky. He had maybe 2 hours before full darkness and temperatures that would drop well below freezing. Time to find out if his grandfather's lessons had stuck better than he'd thought. The wind's howl had changed from a distant whistle to an angry roar that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. Marcus pressed his back against the rock face, his breath coming in sharp puffs that disappeared instantly into the swirling white chaos. The visibility had dropped to maybe 3 feet, and even that was generous. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, rough and weathered like old leather. When nature shows her teeth, boy, you don't fight her head on. You find her weak spots and you slip through like smoke. The cave entrance he'd spotted earlier was somewhere to his right, but in this whiteout, he might as well have been searching for a needle in a haystack made of ice and fury. Marcus forced himself to think methodically. He'd been following the rock wall when he first saw it, a dark slash in the granite about shoulder height. He pressed his gloved hand against the stone and began moving laterally, feeling his way inch by inch. The cold was becoming vicious now, cutting through his winter jacket like it was made of tissue paper. His feet were starting to lose feeling despite his insulated boots, and ice crystals were forming on his eyebrows and the exposed skin around his face mask. Every few steps, he had to stop and clear the snow from his goggles. There's cold, and then there's killing cold, his grandfather had told him during one of their winter camping trips 3 years ago. Killing cold doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It sneaks up quiet-like, making you sleepy, making you want to just sit down for a minute. Marcus recognized the seductive whisper his grandfather had warned him about. His legs felt heavy, and the idea of just sitting down against the rock wall and closing his eyes for a few minutes seemed almost reasonable. He bit down hard on his tongue, using the sharp pain to snap himself back to alertness. The metallic taste of blood mixed with the dry, cold air. His hand suddenly met empty space. Heart hammering, Marcus carefully explored the opening with his fingers. It was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, but it definitely receded back into the mountain. He couldn't tell how deep it was from here, but any shelter was better than facing the full fury of the storm. He squeezed through the opening, immediately grateful for the reduction in wind. The cave was shallow, extending back only about 8 feet, but it was dry and protected on 3 sides. More importantly, the entrance faced away from the prevailing wind direction. Marcus dropped his pack and pulled out his phone. No signal, which he'd expected, but the battery was down to 63%. He switched it to airplane mode to conserve power. The pale screen light revealed rough granite walls and a floor covered with a thin layer of old leaves and debris that had blown in over the years. "First rule of wilderness survival," he muttered, hearing his grandfather's voice blend with his own, "is to stop the bleeding. In this case, bleeding heat." He needed to block the cave entrance partially, enough to stop the wind from turning his shelter into a wind tunnel, but not so much that he'd trap himself or cut off his air supply. Marcus ventured back outside, squinting against the driving snow, and began gathering rocks from the base of the cliff. The work was brutal. Each trip outside felt like being slapped by a frozen giant, and his hands grew clumsy despite his gloves. But gradually he built up a rough wall across the lower half of the cave entrance, leaving the top open for ventilation and escape. Back inside, Marcus pulled out his sleeping bag and spread it over the leaf litter. The temperature difference was immediately noticeable, still cold but no longer the bone-deep, life-threatening cold of the storm outside. He checked his supplies, a half-empty water bottle, 2 energy bars, a bag of trail mix, and a thermos with maybe 2 cups of lukewarm coffee his mother had insisted he bring. Not much for what was shaping up to be a long wait. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, the wind outside rising to a banshee wail that made the rock wall vibrate against his back. Marcus had been in mountain storms before, but nothing like this. This felt primordial, like the mountain itself was trying to shake him loose. He pulled out the small emergency radio from his pack's side pocket and tried scanning for weather updates. Static, mostly, but he caught fragments of an emergency broadcast. Unprecedented storm system, winds exceeding, all mountain highways closed. Do not attempt travel. The radio crackled and died. Marcus stared at the silent device for a long moment, then carefully put it away. Whatever was happening out there, he was on his own now. Just him, his grandfather's half-remembered lessons, and whatever he could scrape together from this hostile wilderness. The real test was just beginning. The wind had teeth now, gnawing through every gap in Marcus's makeshift shelter with predatory hunger. He pressed his back against the cave wall, watching his breath crystallize in the beam of his dying flashlight. The LED was fading to amber, and he knew he had maybe an hour of light left before the darkness swallowed him completely. His grandfather's voice echoed through the howling storm outside. "Fire is life, boy. Everything else is just buying time until you can make fire." Marcus fumbled through his backpack with numb fingers, cataloging his resources like Grandpa Joe had taught him during those summer camping trips that felt like a lifetime ago. A half-empty water bottle already starting to slush, 3 energy bars, his phone, dead weight with no signal, a pocket knife his parents didn't know he carried, and buried at the bottom, wrapped in an old bandana, the ferro rod his grandfather had given him 2 years before he died. "You probably won't ever need this," the old man had said, pressing the metal rod into 12-year-old Marcus's palm. "But if you do, it'll save your life. Promise me you'll always carry it." Marcus had promised, even as his parents rolled their eyes at another one of Grandpa Joe's wilderness paranoia gifts. Now, holding the cold metal in his shaking hands, he whispered a thank you into the storm. But having fire-making tools and actually making fire were 2 different beasts entirely. The cave floor was damp, and most of the debris he'd dragged inside was too wet to catch. Marcus needed tinder, something dry and fibrous that would catch the smallest spark and nurse it into flame. He turned his attention to his own gear, methodically shredding the inner lining of his jacket pocket. The synthetic material was dry, and when he scraped it with his knife, it produced fine strands that felt promising between his fingers. From his jeans, he pulled loose threads, creating a small nest of potential kindling. The ferro rod felt alien in his frozen hands. He'd practiced this dozens of times during those summer trips, but never when his life actually depended on it, never when his fingers barely responded to his commands. The first strike produced nothing. The second sent a weak spark that died before reaching his tinder nest. "Patience, boy. Fire doesn't care how cold you are or how scared you are. Fire only cares that you do it right." Marcus steadied his breathing, focusing on the mechanics. Strike down at a steep angle. Let the sparks fall into the tinder, don't chase them. On the 7th strike, a spark caught, glowing like a tiny orange star in the nest of shredded fabric. He leaned close, breathing gently on the ember, coaxing it to life. The tinder smoldered, then suddenly flared. Marcus had his fire, but keeping it alive would be the real challenge. He fed it carefully with the driest twigs he could find, gradually building up to larger pieces. The smoke stung his eyes and made him cough, but the warmth was intoxicating after hours of brutal cold. For the first time since the storm hit, Marcus felt something other than pure survival terror. He felt pride. The fire changed everything. The cave transformed from a tomb into a refuge. The dancing light pushed back the oppressive darkness, and the heat began to work, feeling back into his extremities. He could think clearly now, plan beyond the next few minutes. Outside, the blizzard raged with renewed fury, as if nature had sensed his small victory and taken it personally. The wind howled through the cave entrance with such violence that it threatened to steal his precious fire. Using rocks and branches, Marcus built a windscreen, angling it to protect the flames while still allowing airflow. As the fire established itself, Marcus turned his attention to his other critical needs. Water would freeze solid in this temperature, but he could melt snow. Food would have to be rationed carefully, 3 energy bars over what could be days. Shelter was adequate for now, but if the temperature dropped further, even the fire might not be enough. He pulled out his phone one more time, hoping against hope for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The screen showed 11:47 p.m. and a battery at 38%. Without power to charge it, the phone would be dead by tomorrow night. His last connection to the outside world reduced to an expensive paperweight. Marcus stared into the fire, letting his mind wander to his parents. They would have reached the lodge by now, would have discovered he wasn't there. Search and rescue would be mobilizing, but no one would fly in this weather. He was truly alone. The realization should have terrified him, but instead, Marcus felt something unexpected settling over him like a heavy blanket. Acceptance. This was his reality now. He could panic or he could survive. His grandfather's lessons had kept him alive this long. Now he had to trust they would carry him through whatever came next. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the cave walls like ancient spirits keeping watch through the long, brutal night ahead. The wind had been lying to him. For the past hour, Marcus had convinced himself the storm was weakening. The howling seemed less violent, the snow less punishing against his makeshift shelter, but as he peered through a gap in his snow wall, reality struck him like a physical blow. If anything, the blizzard had intensified. The world beyond his small sanctuary had vanished completely. No trees, no landmarks, just an endless white void that seemed to swallow sound and light. His shelter was holding, barely. The depression he'd carved beneath the massive fallen spruce provided decent protection from the wind, and the wall of packed snow blocks he'd built using his grandfather's techniques kept the worst of the storm at bay. But the cold was seeping through everything. His clothes, his boots, his carefully constructed barriers. His fingers had gone numb twice already, forcing him to stop and warm them against his body. The fire was his lifeline, a small flame dancing defiantly in the stone circle he'd built. Feeding it required constant attention and precious energy. Every few minutes he had to venture outside his shelter to gather more wood from the fallen branches scattered around the spruce. Each trip left him more exhausted, more exposed to the elements that seemed determined to claim him. Marcus pulled his knees to his chest, trying to conserve body heat. The protein bar he'd eaten an hour ago had helped, but hunger was already gnawing at him again. His body was burning calories at an alarming rate just to stay warm. At this pace, his meager food supply would last maybe another day. After that, he'd have to find alternatives or face starvation. The thought sent a chill deeper than any the wind could produce. He forced himself to think practically, the way Grandpa Joe would have. What resources did he have? What could he improve? The shelter was functional but not ideal. The fire pit could be better insulated. And he needed to think about water. Melting snow required fuel, and fuel was limited. A sudden gust of wind found a weakness in his wall, sending snow cascading into his small space. Marcus scrambled to reinforce the breach, packing snow with his bare hands until his fingers screamed in protest. The cold was becoming more than discomfort, it was becoming dangerous. He could feel his body's core temperature dropping, his thoughts becoming sluggish. That's when he remembered something else his grandfather had taught him during one of their camping trips. They'd been caught in an unexpected rainstorm, and Grandpa Joe had shown him how to create a heat reflector using stones and the reflective side of an emergency blanket. Marcus didn't have an emergency blanket, but he had something almost as good. The metallic emergency poncho tucked in his backpack's side pocket. He'd forgotten about it until now, a lightweight piece of gear that had seemed pointless when he'd packed it. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Every piece of gear has a purpose, Marcus. Sometimes you just have to think creatively about what that purpose is. Working quickly before the cold could sap more of his strength, Marcus arranged flat stones in a semicircle behind his fire. He carefully stretched the poncho between two sturdy branches, creating a reflective surface that would bounce heat back toward his shelter. The improvement was immediate. Warmth that had been escaping into the storm was now redirected, creating a more efficient heating system. But even as he celebrated this small victory, Marcus knew he was fighting a losing battle against time and the elements. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and his resources were finite. Worse, the temperature seemed to be dropping as darkness approached. He could feel it in the way the snow crunched under his feet, in the bite of the air against his exposed skin. He needed to think beyond just surviving the night. He needed a plan for tomorrow, and the day after that. Rescue seemed increasingly unlikely. The storm would have grounded any aircraft, and ground search teams would be useless in these conditions. He was truly on his own, trapped in a wilderness that had claimed experienced hikers and mountaineers. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it sparked something unexpected, a grim determination that surprised him with its intensity. He wasn't ready to die, wasn't ready to become another cautionary tale about unprepared hikers caught in mountain storms. His grandfather's lessons had kept him alive this long. Maybe, just maybe, they'd be enough to see him through. Marcus fed another branch to his fire and watched the flames dance against his improvised reflector. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his survival skills and mental fortitude. But tonight, he was alive, he was warm enough, and he had shelter. In the Canadian Rockies during a blizzard, that counted as victory. The wind continued its relentless assault, but Marcus no longer heard it as a threat. He heard it as a challenge, one he was determined to meet. The emergency whistle's sharp blast cut through the howling wind like a knife through silk. 3 long blasts, pause, 3 more. Jake's grandfather had drilled the pattern into him years ago during their camping trips. International distress signal, the old man's voice echoed in his memory. But don't waste your breath unless you're certain someone's out there. Jake pressed his ear against the ice-crusted wall of his shelter, straining to hear any response over the storm's relentless fury. Nothing. He waited 30 seconds and tried again, his lips already numb from the cold metal. The whistle's piercing cry seemed to mock him as it was swallowed by the blizzard. His hands shook as he tucked the whistle back inside his jacket. The trembling wasn't just from cold anymore, though the temperature had plummeted even further as night approached. Fear gnawed at him with increasing intensity. The shelter that had seemed so promising hours earlier now felt like a tomb of packed snow and desperation. The fire had died again. Jake stared at the blackened remains of his last few twigs, calculating. He had maybe enough dry kindling for 2 more attempts, 3 if he was extremely careful. After that, he'd be gambling with wet wood and bark, assuming he could even find more fuel in this white hell. Think like Grandpa, he told himself, forcing his racing mind to slow down. What would he do? The answer came with startling clarity. His grandfather wouldn't just sit here burning through resources and hope. He'd be preparing for the long haul, making hard choices about survival priorities. Jake pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, wincing at the battery indicator, 43% remaining. At this rate, he'd lose his only reliable light source within hours, but he needed to see what he was working with. Jake methodically inventoried his supplies by the pale lead glow. Half a granola bar, crushed but edible. A small bottle of water, now slushy with ice crystals. His emergency kit yielded a space blanket that crinkled like aluminum foil, waterproof matches, and a small multi-tool his father had insisted he carry. The backpack also contained his school books, useless for survival, but potentially valuable as fuel or insulation. Most importantly, he found something he'd forgotten about, a small container of petroleum jelly from his first aid kit. Grandpa's voice surfaced again, clear as if the old man was sitting beside him. Cotton balls and petroleum jelly make excellent fire starters, Jake. Burns hot and long, even when everything else is soaked. Hope flickered in his chest. He didn't have cotton balls, but the pages from his notebook would work. Jake carefully tore out several sheets and began working the petroleum jelly into the paper, creating improvised fire starters that should burn despite the moisture. As he worked, the wind outside intensified to a shriek that made his shelter walls groan ominously. Snow filtered through gaps he hadn't noticed before, dusting his supplies with fine powder. The temperature inside his refuge was dropping fast. Soon, it wouldn't matter if he had fire. He'd need more insulation or risk hypothermia. Jake made his decision. Working quickly, he began dismantling the interior of his shelter, hollowing out a smaller space that would be easier to heat. He packed the excavated snow into the walls, making them thicker and more insulated. His geography textbook became a floor mat. His history notes were carefully prepared as tinder. The work kept him warm, but it also exhausted his already depleted energy reserves. By the time he finished restructuring his shelter, his breathing came in ragged gasps that created small clouds in the frigid air. Every breath burned his lungs, and his fingers had gone from cold to numb to completely senseless. Hypothermia's first stage he recognized with clinical detachment: shivering, loss of fine motor control, mild confusion. The knowledge was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. At least he could still think clearly enough to recognize his condition. Jake struck one of his precious waterproof matches and touched it to his petroleum jelly fire starter. The flame caught immediately, burning with a steady yellow glow that seemed impossibly bright in his small shelter. He fed it carefully with notebook paper and pencil shavings, nursing it until he could add slightly larger pieces of wood. The fire transformed everything. Heat began to radiate outward, and Jake positioned himself to capture every bit of warmth. He wrapped the space blanket around his shoulders like a cape, creating a reflective barrier that helped trap the heat against his body. For the first time since the storm began, Jake allowed himself to believe he might survive the night. The shelter was smaller but more efficient. The fire was stable. He had enough fuel for several hours, maybe more if he was careful. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault with undiminished fury, but inside his tiny refuge, Jake had created a pocket of relative safety. He pulled out his grandfather's compass and studied it by firelight, planning his next moves. When the storm broke, he'd need to know which direction led back to civilization. The real test was just beginning. The wind had changed. Marcus felt it in his bones before his conscious mind registered the shift, a subtle alteration in pitch that made his stomach clench with primitive dread. He pressed his ear against the snow wall of his shelter, listening to nature's orchestra tuning for a more violent symphony. Through the small observation hole he'd carved at eye level, the world beyond had transformed into something alien. What had been merely brutal was now becoming apocalyptic. Snow didn't fall anymore. It moved horizontally in sheets so dense they seemed solid, like white metal being forged by an invisible hammer. His grandfather's voice echoed from some dusty corner of memory. "The storm's got stages, boy, like a fever. First it whispers, then it talks, then it screams. When it starts screaming, you better have your house in order." The blizzard was beginning to scream. Marcus inventoried his resources with methodical precision, the way Grandpa Joe had taught him to count ammunition during their hunting trips. The emergency pack yielded disappointing results: 3 energy bars reduced to frozen bricks, a half-empty water bottle now containing slush, waterproof matches that were worth their weight in gold, and the small emergency blanket that had probably saved his life during the first night. But it was what he'd constructed that gave him hope. The shelter was more than survival engineering. It was architecture born from desperation and ancestral knowledge. Using techniques he'd absorbed through countless hours at his grandfather's side, he'd built something that could withstand what was coming. The foundation was a lattice of pine branches, woven together with strips torn from his spare shirt and secured with knots his grandfather had shown him beside campfires that now seemed like dreams. Above this framework, he'd layered snow in precise patterns, each handful packed with specific pressure, creating walls that were simultaneously strong and insulating. The genius was in the details Joe had hammered into him: The slight inward curve that distributed weight, the air gaps that trapped heat while preventing collapse, the entrance tunnel that angled downward to keep warmth from escaping. Marcus had even carved ventilation holes with a sharp stick, small enough to preserve heat but large enough to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. But the storm's escalation demanded more. Working by feel in the cramped space, Marcus began reinforcing critical stress points. He'd salvaged wire from his damaged snowboard bindings and was using it to lash additional support branches into place. His hands moved with surprising efficiency, despite the cold muscle memory guiding him through tasks his grandfather had made him repeat, until they became instinctive. The sound outside was becoming inhuman, a banshee wail that seemed to come from the earth itself. Marcus could feel his shelter trembling, testing the limits of his construction. Snow was beginning to accumulate against the outer walls at an alarming rate, and he realized with crystalline clarity that he was in a race against burial. He began digging. Using a makeshift shovel fashioned from a flat piece of snowboard debris, Marcus carved a secondary chamber adjacent to his main shelter. This wasn't just expansion, it was insurance. If the primary structure failed, he'd have a backup. If snow blocked his main entrance, he'd have an escape route. If he needed to store supplies away from his body heat, he'd have a cache. The physical exertion warmed him, but also depleted precious energy. Marcus forced himself to work in intervals, 15 minutes of digging followed by 5 minutes of rest, during which he'd consume tiny portions of an energy bar and assess his progress. The routine kept him focused and prevented the panic that lurked at the edges of his consciousness like a hungry animal. As he worked, fragments of his grandfather's stories surfaced unbidden, tales of miners trapped in avalanches who dug themselves elaborate underground cities before rescue arrived, accounts of Native American survival techniques that enabled people to live beneath snow for weeks, stories Marcus had half listened to while thinking about video games and school, now revealed as the precious inheritance they'd always been. The storm's fury peaked near what he estimated was midnight, though time had become a fluid concept. The shelter groaned and shifted around him like a living thing, snow compacting and settling as wind pressures fluctuated wildly. Marcus lay perfectly still during the worst moments, listening to his construction's dialogue with the storm, ready to evacuate to his backup chamber if necessary. But the engineering held. When the immediate crisis passed and the wind momentarily subsided to merely catastrophic levels, Marcus allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He'd built something extraordinary under impossible conditions. More than that, he'd accessed knowledge he hadn't even known he possessed, drawing from a well his grandfather had spent years filling. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountain, but Marcus was no longer simply enduring it. He was fighting back with the accumulated wisdom of generations, transforming survival from passive resistance into active defiance. He was becoming something the storm couldn't break. The howling wind had become a constant companion, its voice rising and falling like some ancient song of the mountains. Jake pressed himself deeper into the snow cave, feeling the walls around him pulse with each gust that hammered the ridge above. His makeshift shelter had held through the night, but morning brought no relief, only the realization that the storm had intensified beyond anything he'd imagined possible. His hands trembled as he checked his supplies. The granola bars were nearly gone, reduced to crumbs at the bottom of his pack. The water bottles had frozen solid despite his efforts to keep them warm against his body. But it was the cold seeping through his boots that worried him most. He could barely feel his toes, and when he flexed them, sharp needles of pain shot up his legs. "Think, Jake. What would Grandpa do?" The words came out as a whisper, barely audible over the storm's fury. He closed his eyes and tried to summon those long-ago camping trips, the gruff voice sharing wisdom around crackling fires. "Cold's not your enemy, boy. Panic is. Cold just wants respect. Give it that, and you can work with it." Jake forced himself to calm down, to observe rather than react. The snow cave was working. The temperature inside hovered just below freezing, warm enough to prevent hypothermia if he stayed active. But he needed heat, and he needed it soon. His body was burning through calories at an alarming rate just trying to stay warm. He remembered something else, a story Grandpa had told about Inuit hunters who would build body heat through controlled exercises. Jake began with small movements, clenching and unclenching his fists, rotating his ankles, flexing his core muscles. The motions sent warmth coursing through his limbs, and for the first time since dawn, he felt a spark of hope. But hope alone wouldn't get him through another night. He needed to improve his shelter, and that meant venturing back into the storm. Jake pulled his hood tight and crawled toward the entrance. The moment he emerged, the wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into every gap in his clothing. Visibility was virtually zero. He could barely make out the dark shapes of the evergreens just yards away. The world had become a white void, erasing all landmarks and reference points. Moving carefully, he began gathering materials. His grandfather's lessons came flooding back: pine boughs for insulation, rocks to retain heat, dry wood from the protected underside of fallen logs. Each trip outside left him gasping and numb, but he forced himself to continue, knowing that preparation now meant survival later. As he worked, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. The wind patterns were shifting, becoming more erratic. Snow was accumulating faster than before, already beginning to drift against his shelter's entrance. This wasn't just a storm anymore, it was a full-scale blizzard, the kind that could bury entire mountainsides. He needed fire, but starting one in these conditions seemed impossible. Every match was precious, and the wind would snuff out any flame before it could take hold. Then he remembered the emergency fire starter in his pack, a small metal tube filled with petroleum-soaked cotton. Grandpa had insisted he carry it, calling it insurance against stupidity. Working with stiff fingers, Jake hollowed out a small alcove in the back wall of his cave, creating a chimney effect that would draw the smoke up and out. He arranged the driest tinder he could find, shielding it with his body as he struck the fire starter. The cotton caught immediately, and for a heart-stopping moment he thought the flame would die. But then the kindling began to smolder, and suddenly he had fire. The warmth was intoxicating. Jake fed the small blaze carefully, adding larger pieces as it grew stronger. The cave began to warm, and he could feel sensation returning to his extremities. But more importantly, melting snow from the cave walls provided him with much-needed water. As the hours passed, Jake settled into a routine: tend the fire, melt snow for water, exercise to maintain circulation, check the shelter's integrity. It was methodical work that kept both his body and mind occupied, preventing the despair that lurked at the edges of his consciousness. But as darkness fell on his second night in the mountains, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting a losing battle. The storm showed no signs of abating, and his meager food supplies were nearly exhausted. Even with the fire, the cold was a constant presence, sapping his strength with each passing hour. He stared into the flames, seeing Grandpa's weathered face in the dancing light. The old man had survived worse than this, had lived through real hardship when survival meant the difference between life and death. If Jake was going to make it through, he'd need to dig deeper, to find reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. The wind howled its ancient song, and Jake listened, no longer hearing threat in its voice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he had fire. The wind had become a living thing, howling with such ferocity that Marcus could feel it trying to tear apart his shelter, even through the thick walls he'd built. Ice crystals found their way through microscopic gaps, creating tiny tornadoes of snow inside his refuge. He huddled deeper into his sleeping bag, pressing against the back wall where the residual warmth from his body heat had created a slightly less frigid pocket. His candle stub had burned down to nothing hours ago, leaving him in absolute darkness. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable. It was becoming dangerous. He could feel his core temperature dropping despite his layers, and his fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. When he tried to flex them, the movement felt distant and clumsy. Think, Marcus, what would Grandpa do? The old man's voice seemed to whisper through the storm's roar. Heat rises. Boy, use what the earth gives you. Marcus forced himself to move, knowing that staying still meant surrendering to hypothermia. He crawled to the front of his shelter and began digging downward through the floor, his movements awkward but determined. The snow beneath was more compact, older, and as he dug deeper, he noticed something crucial: the temperature difference. 3 feet down, the snow felt less brutally cold against his bare hand. The earth below was insulated by layers of accumulated snow from previous storms, protected from the worst of the surface temperature. His grandfather had once told him about snow caves in Alaska, where miners would dig down to find the thermal layer. Working by feel alone, Marcus carved out a depression in the floor of his shelter, creating a cold sink where the heaviest, coldest air could settle while he rested in the slightly warmer space above. It was a matter of degrees, maybe 5 or 10 degrees warmer, but those degrees could mean the difference between surviving until morning and not surviving at all. As he worked, his mind drifted to keep himself focused on something other than the cold. He thought about his father's voice on the phone 3 days ago, asking about his grades, reminding him to be careful on the mountain. Had it really only been 3 days? It felt like weeks since he'd spoken to another human being. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying. Through the walls of his shelter, he could hear trees cracking under the weight of ice and wind, massive trunks that had stood for decades, suddenly giving way with sounds like gunshots. Each crack made him flinch, wondering if one might fall on his shelter. His stomach cramped with hunger, a sharp reminder that he'd eaten his last energy bar that morning. The granola was gone. Even the emergency rations from his pack were exhausted. He had water by melting snow with his body heat, but water without calories would only sustain him so long. Marcus remembered his grandfather telling him about hunting rabbits in winter, about setting snares and reading tracks in the snow. But in this storm, no animal would be moving. Everything with sense was hunkered down, waiting for the weather to pass. He was on his own until the blizzard exhausted itself. The wind shifted direction suddenly, and he felt a new draft hit the side of his shelter. Panic shot through him as he realized the structure was beginning to sag on one side. He'd built it well, but 3 days of constant wind and accumulating snow were testing its limits. Moving quickly despite his exhaustion, Marcus braced the sagging wall from the inside with his trekking poles, then packed more snow around the exterior weak points. His movements were becoming slower, his coordination less precise. The cold was winning degree by degree. Back inside his shelter, huddled in his makeshift thermal depression, Marcus faced the hardest truth yet: he might not make it through another night. The cold was relentless, and his body's reserves were nearly depleted. His core temperature was dropping, and he could feel the early stages of hypothermia setting in, the confusion, the drowsiness that promised a peaceful sleep he might never wake from. But something in him refused to quit. Maybe it was his grandfather's stubborn streak, inherited through blood and stories. Maybe it was the simple, animal determination to see another sunrise. Whatever it was, Marcus forced himself to stay alert, to keep moving his extremities, to keep his mind active. He began reciting everything he could remember: song lyrics, movie plots, the periodic table from chemistry class. Anything to keep his brain working, to fight off the seductive pull of hypothermic sleep. Outside, the storm raged on with prehistoric fury, but inside his tiny refuge, a 16-year-old boy waged his own battle against the darkness and cold, drawing on reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed. The night stretched ahead like an eternity, and Marcus settled in to fight for every hour, every minute until dawn. The storm had been raging for 36 hours when Marcus realized his shelter was failing. Ice had formed along the interior walls, despite the fire pit he'd dug in the center, and the constant wind had worn grooves in the snow blocks he'd so carefully stacked. Worse, his body heat wasn't enough to maintain the delicate balance between warmth and structural integrity. The ceiling sagged ominously, threatening to collapse and bury him alive. His grandfather's voice echoed through the howling wind. "When nature gives you lemons, boy, you don't make lemonade. You use the acid to clean your wounds and plant the seeds for tomorrow." Marcus crawled toward the entrance tunnel, his movements sluggish from the cold that had seeped into his bones. The sleeping bag dragged behind him, heavy with accumulated moisture that would freeze solid if he stopped moving. Outside, the blizzard struck him like a physical blow, snow crystals sharp as needles against his exposed cheeks. But he wasn't looking for comfort anymore. He was looking for materials. The forest around his shelter had transformed into an alien landscape of sculptured drifts and wind-carved ice formations. Trees bent at impossible angles, their branches encased in shells of frozen snow that clicked and chimed like wind chimes made of bone. Marcus pushed through knee-deep powder, following a half-remembered lesson about reading the landscape during storms. Grandpa Jack had taught him that blizzards created their own geography, redistributing materials and energy in patterns that could be exploited by someone who knew how to look. The old man had called it riding the dragon's breath, using the storm's own force against itself. Marcus found what he was searching for in a natural depression where the wind had carved out a pocket of relative calm. Here the snow had compressed into dense, almost concrete-like layers, while fallen logs had been stripped clean and polished smooth by the constant abrasion of ice particles. Perfect building materials delivered by the storm itself. Working in 20-minute intervals to prevent frostbite, he began constructing something his grandfather had only described in stories, a spiral shelter that would channel the wind's energy instead of fighting it. The design was ancient, supposedly learned from Inuit elders during Jack's northern expeditions, and Marcus had never fully understood the principles until now. The base required precision cutting of the compressed snow blocks, each piece angled to direct airflow in a specific pattern. His hands had lost most feeling hours ago, but muscle memory guided the blade of his improvised snow knife, a flat piece of metal torn from his destroyed tent frame. Blood from numerous small cuts had frozen into dark streaks across his palms, but he couldn't afford to stop. As the walls rose in their calculated spiral, something remarkable began to happen. The shrieking wind that had threatened to tear him apart now seemed to flow around and over the structure, creating a buffer zone of relatively still air. The shelter was actually getting warmer as it grew taller, defying every instinct Marcus had about how buildings should work. The most challenging part came with the roof. Instead of a traditional dome, the spiral design required a twisted covering that would complete the wind-channeling effect. Using the polished logs as a framework, Marcus had to weave together strips of bark, pine boughs, and even pieces of his own torn clothing to create a surface that would hold snow while allowing air to flow in precisely controlled patterns. His movements had become mechanical, driven by a strange clarity that cut through the exhaustion and cold. Every placement mattered. Every angle had to be exact. One mistake would collapse the entire system and leave him exposed to the storm's full fury, with no materials left for another attempt. The final piece, a twisted capstone that would complete the spiral, nearly broke him. His fingers refused to cooperate, fumbling the heavy snow block again and again as wind gusts tried to tear it from his grasp. On the seventh attempt, as darkness began to fall on the second day, he felt the block slide into place with a satisfying click that he felt more than heard. Inside the completed shelter, silence descended like a physical presence. The change was so dramatic that Marcus initially thought he'd gone deaf. But gradually, he became aware of subtle sounds, his own ragged breathing, the distant moan of wind passing overhead, and strangest of all, a low harmonic hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The shelter was singing. Air moved through the spiral structure in carefully controlled currents, creating a natural ventilation system that kept fresh oxygen flowing while preventing heat loss. The walls, now part of a unified aerodynamic system, had stabilized into something stronger than the sum of their parts. Marcus collapsed onto the sleeping bag he'd dragged inside, his body finally allowing itself to acknowledge the true depth of his exhaustion. But for the first time since the storm began, He wasn't shivering. The dragon's breath had become his ally. The wind had found every gap in his shelter, turning what should have been refuge into a torture chamber of cold fingers probing for warmth. Jake's body shook so violently he could barely hold the small piece of birch bark steady as he tried to catch the spark from his ferro rod. The fire had died hours ago, and with it, his hope was rapidly following. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper through the howling storm, "Fire is life, boy. Everything else is just delay." The spark caught, a tiny orange glow in the endless white hell surrounding him. Jake cupped his hands around it, feeding it the finest tinder he could find in his dwindling supply. The flame grew, wavering but determined, and he carefully added larger pieces of kindling. The warmth on his face felt like salvation. But even as the fire crackled back to life, Jake knew he was losing the war. The shelter that had seemed so ingenious yesterday was failing. Snow had accumulated against the windward wall, and the lean-to structure was beginning to sag under the weight. Worse, his body was betraying him. His fingers moved sluggishly, his thoughts came slowly, and twice he'd caught himself nearly falling asleep while sitting upright. He needed to do something radical. Jake stared into the flames and remembered his grandfather's story about the winter of 1962, when a late spring blizzard had caught him 40 miles from the nearest town. Sometimes, boy, you can't just survive what nature throws at you. Sometimes you got to build something that fights back. Fighting back. The concept rolled around in Jake's mind as he surveyed his supplies. His shelter was defensive, designed to hide from the storm. But what if he built something that could actively combat the wind and cold? The idea that formed was so audacious it might have been madness or genius. Jake began dismantling part of his shelter, working methodically despite his exhaustion. He repositioned the larger branches to create a wind tunnel that would channel the storm's fury rather than simply resist it. Using his emergency blanket as a reflector, he constructed a series of baffles that would redirect airflow and create a Venturi effect. The physics was simple in theory, nightmarish in execution. As he worked, the storm seemed to sense his defiance and redoubled its assault. Snow whipped horizontally through the air, each flake a tiny missile seeking exposed skin. His bare hands, necessary for the delicate work of lashing branches with paracord, began to lose sensation entirely. But something was happening. The modified shelter began to sing as wind passed through the channels he'd created, and the temperature differential was creating exactly what he'd hoped for. A low-pressure zone that drew warm air from his fire deeper into the structure while exhausting cold air efficiently. Jake added his most ambitious element, a thermal chimney constructed from overlapped sections of birch bark, sealed with pine pitch he'd heated over the fire. The chimney would create a stack effect, pulling hot air up and through the shelter while maintaining a layer of warm, still air at ground level where he needed it most. As the system came together, Jake felt the first hint of actual warmth he'd experienced in hours. Not just the radiant heat of the fire, but true ambient warmth circulating through his space. The shelter had become something unprecedented, a heating system that used the storm's own energy against it. But his triumph was short-lived. As he settled back to rest, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. One of his main support branches, weakened by the constant stress of wind and the weight of accumulated snow, was beginning to fail. If it gave way completely, the entire structure would collapse, and in his weakened state he might not have the strength to rebuild. Jake grabbed his hatchet and ventured into the storm to find replacement timber. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving him to his knees. The world beyond his shelter was a white void where up and down lost meaning. He could barely see 3 feet in any direction. Moving by touch and instinct, he located a dead pine that would provide the support he needed. But as he began to chop, each swing of the hatchet sent shock waves through his exhausted arms. His movements became increasingly erratic, and twice he nearly struck his own leg. When he finally dragged the timber back to his shelter, Jake discovered that his thermal system had worked almost too well in his absence. The fire had burned hot and fast, consuming much of his remaining fuel. He was faced with a terrible choice: feed the fire and maintain his heating system but risk running out of fuel entirely, or bank the fire for the long term and accept that his body temperature would continue to drop. Through the storm's roar, he could swear he heard his grandfather's voice again, but this time the words were unclear, lost in the wind that seemed determined to strip away everything he'd built, everything he'd learned, everything he was. Jake made his choice and began feeding the fire. The wind had been his enemy for so long that when it finally began to die down, Marcus almost didn't trust the change. He lay still in his snow shelter, listening to the gradual shift from the howling fury that had dominated the last 2 days to something quieter, more manageable. The blizzard wasn't over, but it was weakening. His body screamed protests as he shifted position. Every muscle ached from the constant tension of fighting cold and fear. The pine needle tea had helped, but dehydration and hunger were taking their toll. He'd rationed the last of his energy bars, saving crumbs for when the shaking became unbearable. Now those crumbs were gone. Through the small opening he'd maintained for ventilation, pale light filtered in. Not the artificial brightness of snow reflecting wind-driven particles, but actual daylight. Dawn of the 3rd day. Marcus forced himself to move, flexing fingers and toes that had gone numb during the night. The body heat conservation techniques his grandfather had taught him were the only reason he still had all his digits. He'd kept his core warm by tensing and releasing muscle groups in sequence, a meditation of survival that had become as automatic as breathing. The silence outside was relative. Wind still moved through the trees, but without the violent intensity that had made any movement outside his shelter impossible. He could hear individual branches creaking under their snow load, the distant crack of wood stressed beyond its limits. Food. The thought dominated everything now. His body had been burning through calories at an unsustainable rate, and the hunger had evolved from discomfort to a gnawing desperation that made it hard to think clearly. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When you're hungry enough, you'll remember what you learned about the forest providing." Marcus had seen rabbit tracks before the worst of the storm hit. If the animals were moving again, there might be fresh signs. But trapping required energy he wasn't sure he could spare, and failure would mean wasted calories he couldn't afford to lose. He made the decision to expand his shelter first. If he was going to survive another night, and he had to assume rescue wasn't coming, not with the roads certainly impassable and visibility still poor, he needed a space where he could move around without losing precious heat. Working in short bursts to avoid overexertion, Marcus began excavating. The snow had compacted, but his body heat had created a useful crust on the interior walls. He carved shells for his gear and hollowed out a depression where he could do jumping jacks and push-ups to maintain circulation. The work warmed him, but it also reminded him how weak he'd become. Tasks that should have taken minutes stretched into hours. His movements were deliberate, careful. A twisted ankle or pulled muscle now could be a death sentence. When he finally paused to rest, sitting back against the curved wall he'd shaped, Marcus noticed something that made his heart race. Scratching sounds. Faint, but definitely there. Something was moving in the snow nearby. He held his breath, listening. There it was again, a rhythmic scraping, like claws against ice. His mind raced through possibilities: squirrel, marten, maybe even a rabbit digging through the snow to reach buried vegetation. Moving with infinite care, Marcus positioned himself near the shelter entrance. He'd fashioned a simple snare from the shoelaces of his spare hiking boots, but he'd never actually used it for anything more than practice. The theory was simple: create a noose, position it where an animal would naturally pass through, and wait. The execution was far more complex. The scratching sounds were coming from his left, perhaps 10 feet away. Through the blowing snow, he could make out a dark shape moving against the white. Small, quick movements. Definitely an animal. Marcus spent the better part of an hour setting his snare along what looked like a natural path between 2 fallen logs. The work was delicate, requiring him to balance effectiveness with invisibility. Animals that had survived the blizzard would be both desperate and cautious. As he worked, muscle memory guided his hands. His grandfather's patient instruction from years past, the countless hours spent learning skills that had seemed like games then, now revealed themselves as something far more serious. Every knot mattered. Every measurement could mean the difference between eating and another night with an empty stomach. The trap set, Marcus retreated to his shelter and began the hardest part, waiting. His body wanted to sleep to conserve energy, but he needed to stay alert. If something did get caught, he'd have to act quickly. Injured animals could escape even good snares, and predators might steal his catch if he wasn't vigilant. Outside, the wind continued its gradual retreat, and the scratching sounds grew more frequent. The forest was waking up, creatures emerging from their own survival shelters to face the aftermath of the storm. Marcus checked his watch. 2:47 p.m. Somewhere beyond the mountains, people were probably looking for him. But here, in this moment, everything depended on 18 inches of shoelace and whatever desperate creature might need to pass between two snow-covered logs. The wind had changed. Marcus felt it in his bones before his conscious mind registered the shift, a subtle alteration in the storm's rhythm that made his shelter walls shudder differently. He'd been dozing fitfully when the new sound penetrated his exhaustion, a lower, more ominous howl that seemed to come from the earth itself. Outside, the blizzard was transforming into something else entirely. Marcus pressed his face to the small observation gap he'd left in his shelter wall. What he saw made his stomach drop. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was flying horizontally, driven by winds that had to be pushing 60 miles per hour. Trees that had survived the first 2 days of the storm were now bending at impossible angles, their branches whipping like angry serpents against the grey-white void. This wasn't just weather anymore. This was nature's fury unleashed. The temperature inside his shelter plummeted as the increased wind found every tiny gap in his construction. Marcus could feel the carefully trapped warmth bleeding away, and with it his chances of survival. The pine bough insulation that had seemed so adequate yesterday now felt pathetically thin against this Arctic assault. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. When the mountain shows its teeth, boy, you don't try to fight it head-on. You become like water, flexible, adaptable, finding the path of least resistance. Marcus grabbed his diminishing supply of pine boughs and began frantically reinforcing the windward side of his shelter. His hands moved with desperate efficiency, weaving branches through the existing framework, plugging gaps with snow and debris. But for every breach he sealed, the wind seemed to find 2 more. The cold was becoming a living thing now, creeping through his layers of clothing like icy fingers probing for weakness. His core temperature was dropping, and he could feel his body beginning to shut down non-essential functions. His thoughts grew sluggish, his movements less coordinated. Then he remembered the breathing technique his grandfather had taught him during their winter camping trips, a method for generating internal heat that seemed almost mystical. Marcus positioned himself in the center of his shelter, drew his knees to his chest, and began the rhythmic breathing pattern. Deep inhalation through the nose, hold for 8 counts, explosive exhalation through pursed lips. After 10 minutes, warmth began to bloom in his chest. After 20 minutes, feeling returned to his fingers. It wasn't enough to save him long-term, but it bought him time to think. The wind outside reached a crescendo that made his shelter frame creak ominously. Marcus realized with growing horror that his carefully constructed refuge might not withstand this escalation. If the framework collapsed, he would be exposed to the full fury of the storm with no materials left to rebuild. That's when he made a decision that would have terrified him 3 days ago. He was going to have to partially dismantle his shelter and rebuild it stronger in the middle of the worst storm he'd ever experienced. Working by feel in the cramped space, Marcus began systematically removing the roof sections while leaving the wind barriers intact. Snow immediately began accumulating in the opening, but he forced himself to work methodically. He pulled out several of the main support branches and began lashing them together with strips torn from his spare shirt, creating a more robust triangular frame. The cold bit at his exposed skin like acid, and snow stung his face as he worked. His fingers grew numb despite the breathing exercises, making it harder to tie knots and manipulate materials. But muscle memory from countless hours helping his grandfather with outdoor projects guided his hands even when his conscious mind began to fog. As he worked, Marcus found himself talking to his grandfather as if the old man were right there beside him. "Remember when you made me rebuild that lean-to 4 times because the frame wasn't solid? I hated you for that. Thought you were just being a perfectionist. But you were teaching me this moment, weren't you?" The new framework was lower but infinitely more stable. Marcus quickly began layering pine boughs over the reinforced structure, creating a thicker insulation barrier. He packed snow around the base, not just for insulation but to add mass that would resist the wind's attempts to lift his shelter. By the time he sealed himself back inside, Marcus was shivering violently and his core temperature had dropped dangerously low. But the new shelter held firm against the wind's assault. The difference was immediately noticeable. The walls no longer flexed and shuddered with each gust. He resumed his breathing exercises with desperate intensity, gradually coaxing warmth back into his body. Outside, the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury, but inside his reinforced sanctuary, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in hours: hope. The mountain had shown its teeth, and he had adapted. His grandfather would have been proud. As exhaustion finally claimed him, Marcus drifted into sleep, wondering what other tests the next 12 hours would bring. The storm had been quiet for 3 hours now, and that terrified him more than the howling winds ever had. Jake crouched in his snow cave, listening to the deceptive silence outside. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory: "When nature goes quiet in winter, boy, she's either done with you or preparing something worse." His water supply was nearly gone. The small fire had died an hour ago, and he'd used the last of his dry kindling. The emergency radio crackled with static, but no voices emerged from the white noise. He was running out of time, and deep down he knew the storm wasn't finished. Jake forced himself to inventory what remained: 3 energy bars, a handful of pine nuts he'd gathered before the worst of the blizzard hit, and maybe 6 ounces of water in his bottle. His shelter had held, but the walls were thinning from the constant wind erosion. Most critically, his core temperature was dropping despite his layered clothing. He closed his eyes and tried to channel his grandfather's calm presence. What would the old man do? What lesson was hiding in those childhood camping trips that could save him now? The memory came suddenly, his grandfather building what he'd called a heat sink during a particularly brutal night in Algonquin Park. Not just a fire, but a system that could store and radiate warmth for hours after the flames died. Jake's eyes snapped open. He still had his emergency candle, barely used. More importantly, he had rocks, lots of them, buried under the snow around his shelter. Moving carefully to preserve energy, he began excavating. The snow had hardened into a shell around several large stones he'd noticed when first choosing this spot. His fingers, clumsy in the thick gloves, worked methodically to free them. The first rock came loose after 20 minutes of digging, then another. Soon he had 6 stones, each about the size of his fist, arranged in the center of his shelter. He lit the emergency candle and positioned it carefully among the rocks. The flame was small, almost pathetic against the vastness of his situation, but Jake had learned patience. He wrapped his sleeping bag around himself and the stone arrangement, creating a smaller space for the heat to work within. Gradually, impossibly, warmth began to build. The stones absorbed the candle's heat and radiated it back, creating a micro-environment that felt almost tropical compared to the killing cold outside. As his body temperature stabilized, Jake's mind sharpened. He could think clearly for the first time in hours. The radio, he'd been trying it periodically, but maybe he'd been doing it wrong. His grandfather had been a radio operator in the Merchant Marine. Timing matters with radio, Jake. Atmospheric conditions, solar activity, time of day. They all affect your signal. It was late afternoon now. The storm's electrical interference might be weakening. Jake tried a different approach, switching to emergency frequencies he hadn't attempted before. Static, more static. Then, faint but unmistakable, a human voice. Search and rescue, Sector 7. Weather window closing in 2 hours. Repeat, weather window closing. Jake's hands trembled as he keyed the transmitter. Mayday, Mayday, this is Jake Morrison, stranded in sector. He stopped. He didn't know what sector he was in. He tried again, providing every detail he could remember about his location, the trail he'd been on, the approximate distance from the parking area, the distinctive rock formation he'd seen before the storm hit. Silence stretched for long minutes. Then, Jake Morrison, this is Banff Search and Rescue. We copy your transmission. Can you provide any visual markers for aerial spotting? Aerial spotting. Jake's heart raced. They were actually looking for him. But how could they see his position from the air? His shelter was designed to be invisible, blended into the natural landscape. The answer came from another memory, his grandfather teaching him about signal fires, about making smoke that could be seen for miles. But Jake had no wood left, nothing that would burn long enough or hot enough to create the kind of signal he needed. Except, he looked at his sleeping bag, his extra clothing, his backpack. All synthetic materials that would burn hot and produce dark, visible smoke. It would mean sacrificing his insulation, his protection, everything that was keeping him alive. But if search and rescue was coming, if they had a window to reach him, it might be his only chance. Jake made the calculation in his head. His heat sink system could keep him warm for maybe 4 hours. If they couldn't spot him in that time, if the weather window closed, he'd die anyway, but more slowly, and with the crushing knowledge that rescue had been within reach. He grabbed his spare jacket, synthetic fiber filling that would burn like a torch. Outside the shelter, the wind was picking up again. The storm's eye was passing over, and soon the back wall would hit with renewed fury. Jake looked at the jacket in his hands, then up at the grey sky where somewhere people were risking their lives to find him. It was time to bet everything on one last signal. The wind had changed. After 3 days of relentless howling, the sudden shift in its voice made Marcus lift his head from where he'd been dozing fitfully against the shelter wall. The sound was different now, less like a freight train and more like a dying animal's moan. Through the gaps in his snowblock construction, he could see something he hadn't witnessed since the storm began, actual visibility beyond 10 feet. His heart hammered as he carefully dismantled part of his entrance. The improvement was real. The blizzard was finally breaking. But Marcus knew better than to celebrate yet. Grandfather had warned him about the false promises of mountain storms. They'll give you hope just to snatch it away. The old man's voice echoed in his memory. Wait, watch, be sure. He spent the next hour observing the weather patterns, noting how the wind gusts became less frequent and the snow changed from horizontal sheets to actual falling flakes. When he was confident the worst had passed, Marcus began his preparations to leave. The shelter had kept him alive, but it had also become his prison. 3 days of being cramped in the small space had left his muscles stiff and his joints aching. As he gathered his meager supplies, Marcus realized how much the ordeal had changed him. His hands moved with new efficiency, checking and rechecking his gear with an attention to detail that would have impressed Grandfather. The emergency blanket went back in his pack, along with the remaining energy bars, now just crumbs at the bottom of the wrapper. His water supply was critically low despite melting snow. The matches were down to 6 precious sticks. Every item had become sacred, irreplaceable. Before sealing the shelter entrance, Marcus took one last look at his creation. The snow blocks had held perfectly, even under the storm's assault. Ice had formed natural mortar between the joints, creating something stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. In 72 hours, he'd built more than just a shelter. He'd constructed a testament to everything Grandfather had tried to teach him. The first steps outside were treacherous. Snow had drifted against the shelter, creating a landscape Marcus barely recognized. What had been the trail was now buried under 4 feet of pristine white. The familiar landmarks, the bent pine, the distinctive rock formation, had vanished under winter's erasure. But the storm's retreat revealed something else. The sun, weak and filtered through breaking clouds, but real. Marcus felt tears freeze on his cheeks as he tilted his face toward that pale disk of hope. He'd forgotten how beautiful light could be. Navigation would be nearly impossible in this transformed world, but Marcus had planned for this too. During the storm's brief lulls, he'd used his compass to fix his bearings. The highway lay roughly northeast, probably 3 miles through terrain that was now a moonscape of snowdrifts and hidden obstacles. Every step was a calculated risk. The snow varied wildly in depth, sometimes supporting his weight, other times plunging him waist-deep into hidden crevices. Marcus learned to read the subtle signs, the slight color variations that indicated solid ground versus dangerous hollows, the way shadows fell across the contours. 2 hours in, exhaustion began clawing at him again. The brief energy boost from leaving the shelter was fading, replaced by the brutal reality of post-storm travel. His legs felt like lead weights, and his breathing came in sharp gasps in the thin, frigid air. That's when he saw it, a flash of orange through the trees ahead. Marcus blinked, certain it was a hallucination. But as he struggled forward, the color resolved into something unmistakably human-made. A piece of emergency equipment, probably torn loose during the storm, which meant he was near the highway. New strength flooded his limbs as Marcus pushed through the last 100 yards. The orange object was a traffic cone, half buried but definitely marking the road's edge. Beneath the snow lay the blessed flat expanse of asphalt, invisible but real. He'd made it to the highway but now faced a new choice. Which direction? Left could lead deeper into the mountains, right might take him toward civilization, or it might lead nowhere. In his exhausted state, the wrong choice could be fatal. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember the drive up with his family. They'd passed a gas station about 5 miles from the trailhead. The question was whether he'd emerged onto the highway above or below that point. The decision came down to instinct and the faintest memory of how the road curved. Marcus turned right and began walking down the center of the buried highway, following what he hoped was the path back to the world of the living. Behind him, his footprints marked the first human passage through this transformed landscape. Each step carried him further from the boy who'd entered the mountains 3 days ago, and closer to whoever he was becoming. The wind had changed direction sometime during the night, and Marcus woke to an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. The constant howling that had become his white noise companion for the past 3 days was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling, the whispered hiss of settling snow. He pushed against the shelter's entrance flap, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flared in his chest as he realized what had happened. The storm had buried him alive. Fighting down the rising terror, Marcus forced himself to think. Grandpa's voice echoed in his memory. "Snow's heavy, boy. Heavier than you'd think, but it's also got air pockets. You work smart, not hard." Marcus felt along the shelter's walls, searching for the weakest point. The pine bough framework had held, but snow pressed against every surface like a crushing fist. He found where the branches seemed to bend the most and began carefully pushing, creating a small hollow. Snow cascaded in, and he scooped it aside, packing it behind him. The work was exhausting. Every few minutes he had to stop, chest heaving, the thin air making him dizzy, but gradually, inch by painful inch, he carved a tunnel upward through the white tomb. When his numb fingers finally broke through to open air, he could have cried with relief. Pale sunlight filtered down through the hole, and he widened it enough to squeeze through, emerging like some frozen groundhog into a world transformed. The storm was over. Marcus stood waist-deep in pristine snow, turning slowly to survey the aftermath. The landscape was utterly changed, rolling white dunes where rocky outcroppings had been, snow-laden trees bent into impossible arches, the very topography rewritten by nature's fury. His shelter was completely invisible beneath the white blanket. If he hadn't known exactly where it was, he never would have found it. But something else caught his attention. There, perhaps a quarter-mile away, a thin column of dark smoke rose straight up in the still air. Marcus stared at it, afraid to believe his eyes. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. After 3 days of fighting for survival in complete isolation, the sight of that smoke column hit him like a physical blow. His legs went weak, and he sank back down into the snow, shaking. He wasn't alone anymore. The trek to the smoke source was a nightmare of post-holing through snow that sometimes reached his armpits. Every step was a battle, punching through the crust, pulling his leg free, taking another step. His makeshift snowshoes from yesterday were buried somewhere beneath the shelter, and he didn't have the energy to dig for them. Halfway there, he had to stop and rest, leaning against a snow-covered boulder while his heart hammered against his ribs. The cold was seeping through his layered clothing, finding every gap in his defenses. His feet had gone numb again, and he couldn't feel his fingertips despite the mittens. But the smoke was still there, still rising, still real. When Marcus finally crested the small ridge, he saw them. 2 figures in bright orange rescue gear were setting up some kind of equipment near a blazing fire. One looked up at his approach, shouted something to the other, and then both were wading through the snow toward him. "Marcus Chen?" The voice was muffled by a balaclava, but Marcus could hear the relief in it. "Jesus, kid, we've been looking for you for 3 days." Marcus tried to answer, but his voice came out as a croak. The rescuer, a woman with kind eyes visible above her face mask, reached him first and immediately began checking him over with practiced efficiency. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked, shining a light in his eyes. "Marcus," he managed. "Marcus Chen. Good. I'm Sarah. I'm with North Shore Rescue. This is Tom. We're going to get you out of here, okay? But first, I need to check you for frostbite and hypothermia." The next few minutes passed in a blur of medical assessments, emergency heat packs, and hot liquid being pressed into his hands. The rescuers worked with calm efficiency, wrapping him in a specialized warming blanket and radioing their position to someone called base. "How did you survive out here?" Tom asked as they prepared to move. "The storm was Category 5. We've got grown men with full winter gear who wouldn't have lasted 1 night in what you just went through." Marcus looked back toward where his buried shelter lay hidden beneath the snow. 3 days ago, he'd been a suburban teenager whose biggest challenge was algebra homework. Now he felt like he'd aged years in those 72 hours. "My grandfather taught me some things," he said simply. As the rescue helicopter's distant rotors began to echo off the mountain walls, Marcus closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude to a stubborn old man who'd insisted that a city boy needed to know how to survive in the wild. Some lessons, he realized now, were worth more than gold. The wind had changed. After 3 days of relentless howling, the sound that had become the soundtrack to his survival now carried a different note, softer, less vicious. Ethan pressed his ear against the ice wall of his shelter, listening to the storm's dying breath. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "The mountain will tell you when she's finished fighting. Listen for the silence between the gusts." There it was. Those precious seconds of quiet that meant the blizzard was finally loosening its grip on the Rockies. Ethan's body protested as he shifted position. His left shoulder throbbed where he'd wrenched it during the avalanche, and his fingers were still numb despite the crude mittens he'd fashioned from his torn jacket lining. But he was alive. Against all odds, through 72 hours of nature's most brutal test, he had survived. The shelter around him was a testament to desperation and ingenuity. What had started as a simple snow cave had evolved into something far more complex, a multi-chambered survival system that would have made his grandfather proud. The main chamber where he huddled was just large enough for his body, designed to trap and recirculate his body heat. A smaller alcove held his remaining supplies, half-a energy bar, melted snow in his water bottle, and the emergency flare he'd been saving for this moment. Connected to the main chamber by a narrow tunnel was his greatest achievement, a workshop of sorts where he'd spent hours carving and shaping. Using nothing but his multi-tool and sheer determination, he'd created a series of tools from salvaged materials: a spear tip fashioned from a broken ski pole, fishing hooks carved from zipper pulls, most importantly, snowshoes constructed from pine branches and strips of fabric torn from his backpack. The wind gusted once more, then fell silent. Ethan counted: 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. 5 seconds of complete silence. The storm was breaking. He crawled toward the entrance of his shelter, pausing at the wall of snow blocks he'd built to seal himself in. Each block had been cut and fitted with precision, creating an airtight barrier against the storm while allowing just enough ventilation to prevent carbon dioxide poisoning. Another lesson from Grandpa Joe: the mountain can kill you with your own breath if you're not careful. Working carefully, Ethan began dismantling his wall. The blocks came away easily, and suddenly cold air rushed into the chamber, different air, cleaner, without the violent edge of the past 3 days. He pushed through the opening and emerged into a world transformed. The blizzard had sculpted the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Snowdrifts towered 20 feet high, and the familiar landmarks of the hiking trail had vanished beneath a pristine white blanket. But overhead, patches of grey-blue sky were visible through the dissipating clouds. Ethan struggled to his feet, his muscles cramping from days of confinement. The snowshoes he'd crafted held his weight on the surface, distributing it just enough to prevent him from sinking into the deep powder. He took a tentative step, then another. They worked. From his elevated position, he could see the valley below. Somewhere down there was the main trail, and beyond that, the ranger station where his parents were undoubtedly coordinating search efforts. But between him and safety lay miles of treacherous terrain, made even more dangerous by the fresh snowfall. He pulled the emergency flare from his pocket, feeling its weight. 1 shot. If he used it now, any search helicopters in the area might spot the signal. But if no one was looking yet, if the storm had grounded all aircraft, he'd waste his only chance at aerial rescue. Another of his grandfather's lessons surfaced: sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one. Ethan made his decision. He raised the flare skyward and pulled the trigger. The red streak shot into the grey sky, leaving a trail of smoke and burning bright against the clouds. For precious seconds, it hung there like a beacon of hope before falling back to earth and hissing out in the snow. Silence returned, broken only by his ragged breathing and the distant sound of settling snow. He waited, counted minutes, strained his ears for the sound of helicopter rotors or rescue vehicles. Nothing. The reality settled over him like another layer of cold. The rescue would have to wait. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to see his family again, he would have to rescue himself. Ethan shouldered his makeshift pack, checked the crude compass he'd fashioned using a needle and piece of cork, and began his descent into the valley. Each step was a small victory, each breath a defiance of the mountain that had tried to claim him. Behind him, his survival shelter stood as proof of what desperate ingenuity could accomplish. Ahead lay the unknown, but for the first time in 3 days, the unknown didn't feel like certain death. It felt like possibility. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Jake stumbled from his snow cave, squinting against the brilliant morning sun. 3 days had transformed him into someone else entirely, leaner, harder, with eyes that held depths they hadn't possessed before. The rescue team rappelled down through the glittering powder, their bright orange gear a stark contrast against the pristine wilderness that had nearly claimed him. "Son, are you hurt?" The lead rescuer's voice carried genuine amazement as he took in the elaborate shelter system Jake had constructed. What they found defied every expectation of teenage survival capability. Jake's snow cave wasn't just a hollow in the drift. It was an engineering marvel born of desperation and his grandfather's half-remembered lessons. The main chamber connected to smaller alcoves through carefully carved tunnels, each serving a specific purpose. Ventilation shafts angled upward at precise degrees to prevent carbon dioxide buildup while maintaining heat. A cold trap near the entrance kept frigid air from penetrating the living space. Most remarkably, he'd built a tiered sleeping platform that utilized the cave's warmth stratification, keeping him elevated where the temperature remained most stable. "My grandfather," Jake croaked, his voice barely recognizable after 3 days of minimal use. "He taught me. Sort of." The rescuer, Peterson, according to his name tag, shook his head in disbelief. "Son, what you've built here would impress a survival instructor. The thermal efficiency alone." He trailed off, studying the carefully packed snow walls that showed no signs of dangerous melting or collapse. As they prepared him for evacuation, Jake's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the overwhelming realization of what he'd accomplished. The scared teenager who'd panicked when the blizzard first hit was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival wasn't about luck or hope. It was about making hard choices, trusting your instincts, and finding strength in places you never knew existed. During the helicopter ride down the mountain, Jake pressed his face to the window, watching his snow cave grow smaller below. From this height, he could see how perfectly positioned it was, sheltered from prevailing winds by a natural rock formation, positioned to catch the first morning sun for psychological warmth, situated near enough to scatter deadfall that he'd been able to gather fuel for his small warming fires. The hospital in Banff buzzed with activity as word spread about the teenager who'd not just survived, but thrived during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Dr. Sarah Chen examined him thoroughly, expecting to find frostbite, dehydration, signs of exposure. Instead, she discovered someone in remarkable condition considering his ordeal. "Your core temperature is normal," she said, reviewing his chart. "Slight dehydration, some minor cuts and bruises. But honestly, Jake, I've seen people in worse shape after a weekend camping trip." His parents arrived that evening, his mother alternating between sobs of relief and fierce hugs that threatened to crack his ribs. His father stood quietly for a long moment, studying Jake's face with new recognition. "Your grandfather would be proud," his father finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never really understood what he was trying to teach you during those summer visits. I thought it was just old man stories." Jake nodded, remembering those afternoons on his grandfather's porch, listening to tales that had seemed like ancient history. Now he understood that every seemingly random detail, how to read snow conditions, the way wind patterns revealed shelter opportunities, the critical importance of staying dry, had been carefully chosen lessons, planted like seeds in his young mind. The story made national news within days. Reporters called him a miracle, a prodigy, a testament to human resilience. But Jake knew the truth was both simpler and more complex. He'd survived because his grandfather had loved him enough to share hard-won wisdom, even when that wisdom seemed outdated in a world of GPS devices and satellite phones. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in his grandfather's old workshop, running his hands over tools he'd never really noticed before. A lifetime of knowledge surrounded him. Books on wilderness survival, hand-drawn maps of remote mountain regions, journals filled with observations about weather patterns and animal behavior. This wasn't just a hobby collection, it was a master class in self-reliance that had been waiting for him all along. His phone buzzed with another interview request, another opportunity to tell his story. But Jake had already decided he was done talking about those 3 days. The real lesson wasn't in the telling, it was in the learning, in understanding that survival skills weren't relics of the past, but essential tools for an uncertain future. Outside, snow began to fall again, and Jake smiled. He was no longer afraid of the storm.